Welcome, everybody. Glad to have so many of you join us here today for the first of our series of 4 webinars to launch our analysis of FTSE 100 corporate reporting trends in 2020. Really excited to have so many of you here with us today. I think we've had almost 300 registrations for this event, so I'm really looking forward to sharing with you a lot of what we've seen, but also hearing from you about your questions about what we've seen. So we'll try to keep it as interactive as possible. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Sally Pilot. I am the Chief Insight and Engagement Officer at Black Sun. That means I spend a lot of my time engaging externally with Marketplace to understand what's going on and feed that back to our teams and our clients, and then have a general oversight on all of our research and insight that comes out of Black Sun. The other thing that might be of note is I have 4 children and a dog, so I have about a 50% chance of being interrupted on this webinar, so please bear with me. I've also got my colleague Anne Kirkby, who's the lead consultant at Black Sun, who's with me today to share some of our findings. Just wanted to tell you a little bit about Black Sun. We're a stakeholder communications company. We are strategic storytellers, led by insight, driven by creativity, and powered by technology. And we've been helping businesses really try to communicate authentically how they deliver value to their wider stakeholders, okay? And I think that is more important than ever moving forward. And you know, we're lucky enough to work with some great ambitious companies who want to build better businesses through better communications. So we really look forward to extending those relationships moving forward. So just a little bit more about what we do as a company, and then I'll move on. So we do this, if we just flip the slide, in terms of bringing the corporate story to life, we do it across multiple audiences, stakeholders, investors, employees, customers, and communities, and across multiple channels, okay? That's probably enough about us. And what I wanted to move on to is the Horizon series, which is really our research brand. So this research that we're going to take you through today, Rewiring the Ecosystem for Resilience, is the flagship piece of our research series, the Horizon series. And I wanted to take you through a little bit of the journey that we've been on in the 15 years of doing research, because we've been studying really the power of communications in changing behavior, increasing transparency, and improving engagement between businesses and their key stakeholders since 2005. So just to go through a little bit of a deep dive in terms of the corporate reporting trends research, where we focus on the FTSE 100. As I said, we've done it for 15 years. And for me, the origins of the research really were 15 years ago. There was an enormous amount of change and uncertainty in the marketplace, changing legislation, regulation, a lot more demands in terms of on companies in terms of accountability. And the reason we first started is what I had a number of my clients come to me and say, Sally, what does it mean? What should we do? And what is everybody else doing about this? And that's really why we started tracking the FTSE 100, to share that information with clients. And for the first few years, we were very focused on reporting. So the title of the first research piece was called What's Happening in Corporate Reporting? The next one was called Where Are We Now with Corporate Reporting? And this gives you a sense of where the world and the market was. There was beginning to be a lot of change and focus on accountability, as I said. And all the while we knew this was really important and an obligation for companies to report on these things, we also very much talked to our clients about it being an opportunity for companies to really communicate about these things and more broadly demonstrate their accountability. And then I guess about 10 years ago, we really started encouraging clients to think beyond reporting and really begin to tell their story a lot more effectively. And that, in fact, was the title of our research 10 years ago, Tell Your Story. And I think this was a turning point. Why? Because I think we were beginning to see that these changes were beginning to drive a different type of conversation, both internally and externally. And we saw how this greater demand for transparency and need for greater disclosure was actually helping companies to improve engagement within their own business and with their key stakeholders. So this kind of process of reporting that companies were having to go through in communications was helping to change behaviors and mindsets. And we saw the titles of the research as well evolve from Tell Your Story to Capture Value to Make Connections. So really emphasizing all these things that companies, we are encouraging them to do. To about 5 years ago, we were encouraging companies to live their story because we thought it was going beyond just a one-way communications about tell your story, but actually you needed to demonstrate how you were engaging with your different stakeholders and how you were living your values. So I think that's quite an important transition. And that's really when we launched Web 100, which is our review of the corporate websites of the FTSE 100. And that's when we really realized the importance of a company telling its story more widely through other channels to multiple stakeholders, but in a consistent and coherent way. Consistency is hugely important. And we also realized the importance of moving from just a static once a year communications to communicating more continuously. And that's gone from strength to strength and helped us to understand other channels and wider stakeholders. I think, so I reflect on this and I think, where are we now? I think we're at another turning point. For the last 4 or 5 years, we've very much focused on our principles of trust, which Anne will go through in a lot more detail in terms of the background, but really going beyond the tick boxing approach to reporting to really capture sort of the spirit of behaviorals, I think, and focusing on things like purpose and culture and wider value creation. And I think the world has changed significantly over the last few months. We're in the middle of an economic crisis, a social crisis, and a climate crisis. And I think one of the silver linings of COVID is that it's clearly shown us how economic, social, and environmental aspects are interlinked, and that technology will also be a critical enabler of a transformation. And I really believe that leadership and culture will help to drive this business transformation and the innovation needed for the future. So the principles of trust that I briefly outlined are ones, as I said, we've been emphasizing for several years now, but I think they'll be the key to drive the change needed moving forward. So again, I think the title captures the challenge facing corporates today, rewiring the ecosystem for resilience. And in this research, we call for organizations to rethink and rewire, to rebuild the trust of their stakeholders to prosper over the long term. And going back to one of my tenets that I talked about, this idea that reporting and communications should be seen as an opportunity, not just an obligation, has shifted, I think. And I think we're living in a world where new contracts are being drawn up between society and business, business and government, government and society. And now undoubtedly, there is not just an opportunity, but there is an obligation for businesses to evidence corporate accountability around purpose, culture, cognitive diversity, and our other principles. And I think these will be critical to forging strong relationships with key stakeholders and critical to demonstrate positive impact on the economy and wider society, and contribute ultimately to wider trust. So we think obligation as well as opportunity now. So not just obligation, not just opportunity, but the two of them hand in hand. Look, we're super privileged to work for so many amazing clients and help them with this transformation. And we're working with our clients, not just on their reporting, but how we can meet the needs of broader communications, whether that's helping capture the spirit of regulation in their reporting, creating a corporate website which reinforces purpose, inspiring people via social media, or engaging with wider stakeholders on sustainability. We do all of those things and much, much more. And after 15 years, we all remain passionate in our pursuit of what's next. And the team is super passionate about navigating this new world and look forward to taking our clients and you beyond the next horizon. So without further ado, that was the setup I wanted to give about the journey of the research moving forward. And then I'll pass over to my colleague, Anne, to take us through the research this year and share some of our findings.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Anne Kirkby. I head up the insight function at Black Sun. That includes sort of the day-to-day consultancy work that we do with clients on annual report and more widely around ESG communication. But this particular piece of research around the 6 principles of trust is also within my remit. And I'm going to take you through some of the key findings this year. And as I'm sure you will appreciate when I go through it, we expect to see a lot more from our clients going forward around ESG, because that is a major issue in this year's research. Now, what is the Complete 100? And I should probably say, what do you think? What do you mean Complete 100? Complete 100 is a term that we use and have used throughout the last 15 years for this flagship research, because it covers the sort of full FTSE 100. Now, every research, as Sally went through earlier, every research publication every year have their own title to sort of reflect what it is we're seeing. But this research is, as Sally also said, in its 15th edition, and it looks at the full FTSE 100, every report. We have about 1,000 different data points, of which this report only publishes a small minority of. We use this research really to sort of track developments in corporate reporting. So how are those developments changing? How is the narrative changing? How are companies incorporating sort of new regulatory changes or societal changes or sort of debates? And what does that mean for the future? So we also sort of track what we call little sort of a tester questions to sort of identify emerging trends, so that we can also help our clients figure out what will the future look like. And basically, that's why we do this research in the first place. We're not a research organization, but we do this to help clients make sure that their reporting hits the nail on the head, exactly where they want it to be. So whether that is pushing the boundaries or that is actually being in the middle of the road, and that's quite beneficial for the research. Now, difference to previous years this year is that we have split our research into 3 reports. So there's the 6 principles of trust report, which is the one you look at, we'll be going through today. There is the building blocks report, which focuses on the typical elements of an annual report. So you'll see business model, strategy, performance, remuneration, that sort of thing in the next report. And then the final report is a 2020 vision report, which focuses on some of the key themes for 2020. And then at the end, we will publish a report that incorporates all of them. I think it's fair to say that our research, and certainly the findings of the research, is very much focused around, has been very much impacted by sort of recent regulatory change. So we have obviously the new corporate governance code, or the 2018 corporate governance code, that is coming into place this year, the miscellaneous reporting regulation coming into place this year, and the same thing goes for the guidance and strategy report. So although, you know, a lot of companies have been working towards this over the last 2 years, this is a year it counts. And that is clear to see from a lot of the research findings. So you might have heard me now talk several times about the 6 principles of trust. The 6 principles of trust is something that Black Sun developed a couple of years ago as a way of communicating some of the new regulatory changes to clients, to, you know, shine a light on the aspects that corporates need to focus on in order to gain trust with their different stakeholders. And it goes much beyond corporate reporting as well. But some of these are the 6 principles of trust, as we call them, are purpose, it's stakeholder engagement, culture, cognitive diversity, responsible business, and long-term transformational and long-term thinking. So together and individually, they are some of the key elements in developing this trust with stakeholders. And the key focus of this year's research. We call the research this year the Rewiring the Ecosystem for Resilience. And that's really to reflect not just what we're seeing, because that's still at a very early stage of what we're seeing in terms of the research, but it's also to really reflect the direction of travel going forward. There's a very strong call for a build back better solution. So for a lot of sort of sustainability issues, not to take a back seat as a consequence of COVID, but actually for that to be the driving force in finding a more sustainable solution going forward. We're seeing, an accelerated focus on corporate purpose as a consequence of COVID-19. A lot more companies talking about purpose, and we all of a sudden starting to see this concept of purpose in practice rather than in theory, as we've been talking about it in the past, really. And really, purpose is that point in time, or crisis is that point in time where a purpose becomes really crucial in what you should and shouldn't be doing. Finally, COVID has also really highlighted ESG as a key driver of the future. Not only have we, seen almost all sort of results calls talking ESG language, even the most sort of hardcore mainstream investors who are definitely not ESG investors have all of a sudden, started to have this as a natural part of the narrative to be talking about, your stakeholders, to be talking about your purpose, to be talking about your customers, to be talking about your employees and health and safety, and all of these things that would have been, unusual for them to be talking about in the past. So I'd be very surprised if that narrative then goes back to the way it was going forward. And also from an ESG perspective, we've seen a lot of companies who are very strong on ESG still having, being more resilient during the COVID crisis. We've seen them even sometimes performing better comparatively to peers, suggesting that there is a clear link between, ESG as an indicator of better management, perhaps. And we're also obviously seeing a lot more money flowing into ESG products still, despite the COVID crisis. So as Sally talked about a little bit before, we're actually seeing sort of a full circle in. We've gone from originally being this is an obligation to be talking about some of these issues to now it was an opportunity, and now it's really an obligation, but the obligation has absolutely grown in terms of what it is that's expected of companies. So the next bit I'll take you through is I'll take you through each of the 6 principles of trust. And the first one really is around purpose. And purpose is an area that has moved quite a lot this year in many ways. We've moved, as you can see here, 88% of companies set out a purpose, which is a substantial increase from, say, in 2015, with 33% of companies talked about purpose. So clearly there's an indication here that regulatory change is impacting. But also, I think purpose is in the air. A lot of companies are talking about it. And as you can see here, 45% of chairmen talk about purpose in the leadership statement. So it is clearly coming from the top down. However, we are also seeing a number of things that suggest that it's still a little bit too unspecific. So 43% do, as I said, provide that narrative link between purpose and strategy, which is an substantial increase to last year. But it is a sort of a crucial tenet in what companies should be doing according to both the code and the guidance. So we would have expected a little bit more narrative around that. And actually, when you start looking at it, you can see sometimes it is the purpose used as the heading for the strategy section, for instance, with a very little reference to what the purpose actually means in terms of strategy and sort of future direction. Again, CEOs made it less onto the agenda for CEOs clearly than the chairman's agenda, which is probably a reflection of the fact that purpose sits in terms of regulation, sits within the board's remit of they need to have overall oversight with it. So suggesting that there's perhaps a little bit of sort of regulatory compliance element in the focus on purpose this year. So we've set out here for each of the 6 principles, we set out sort of an evolution of approaches. So stage 1 in the bottom here shows you where people tend to start out, and stage 3 where they, you know, what's the ultimate aim that they should be aiming for. So really, stage 1 is we have our purpose on the inside front cover. And stage, so the ultimate aim is really, you know, it sets our direction of travel. It doesn't just focus on all the things that we should be doing, all the things we want to be doing, all the things we want to create value for, but also what things we don't want to do. What are the trade-offs? You know, it should be acting as a filter for the things that we do, but also the things that we don't do. And I think that's probably the weakest point with purpose at the moment, is that it's unfocused.
And I know from some of our conversations, you're actually quite encouraged by what you're seeing with some of our clients in terms of really getting under the skin of this. Do you want to just share sort of the change that we've seen maybe in the last 12 months around that?
Well, I would say particularly in the last 3 months, I've been very encouraged when companies bring up unprompted conversations around purpose in relation to what they're seeing. So I think the whole COVID crisis really has brought purpose to the forefront of companies' minds, you know, in terms of how they should be acting during crisis. And I think purpose is really crucial during a crisis. And I think the COVID in many ways has served as an accelerator for a lot of the trends that we're seeing when we talk to companies. Obviously, this is not what's coming through in the research, because it focuses on reports that were published before.
Great.
Yeah. So moving on to the next one, which is culture. And culture really is an area that is also moving. It's moving to, if you've been to some of these events before, you may have heard me talk about how culture has in the past been talked very much about as how do we protect value from being destructed? How do we make sure our people do not destroy, you know, act in a way that could potentially destroy value? And that has changed a little bit in the sense that companies are increasingly talking about the kind of how it can create value for them. So how will the culture, what is the kind of culture they want to have to be able to have a more innovative approach, the way that they can, you know, be more customer centric, to be more focused on you know, being if you want to be a company it's sort of in a situation where you have to have smart risk taking, for instance, or you need to be moving really fast. What is that kind of culture, and what are those measures, and where does that start? Well, no, maybe that starts at the recruitment stage. So we're seeing a little bit more around this in terms of these measures: transformation, customer centricity, innovation, productivity. However, I would also say there aren't many, so there's a lot of sort of commitment, but not necessarily a lot of sort of really hardcore, what does that actually mean for us from a sort of commercial angle? And you can see here, only 27% actually set out gauges or measures of culture. So that also suggests that when the board has sort of reassures itself that the culture of the company is aligned with long-term thinking, that they might almost be going by anecdotal evidence and the employee survey. And really, there are so many other measures that they should perhaps be looking at that give a better indication of how they're seen externally as well. Finally, culture as a principal risk, 9%, so hasn't moved substantially since last year. And if it is truly a driver of sort of a commercial opportunity or driver of success, then surely it should be more than just 9% companies who have it as a principal risk. So here we go. The evolution of approaches we're seeing here. The sort of bottom stage here really is companies who set out culture is important, here are our values, and then that's it. Or even say we have values and not even set out what those are. Equally, we have on the other end of the scale companies who talk about how culture is an enabler of success. and how it specifically feeds into the kind of company they want to be in the future, and how they are investing in a way and recruiting in a way and remunerating in a way that furthers that development. Yeah.
Just to pick up on one of the questions that we've got from one of the attendees, and it probably works across both purpose and culture. Are there best practices that are emerging for those companies that are embedding that across their reporting in terms of your stage 3? Is there examples that we've seen where companies are actually doing that currently, so fully embedded in corporate reporting and communications, or are there just a few at the sort of at the edge there, and that's where we're encouraging companies to go?
Well, it's partly both. So we have some who sit in a category where they are talking about customer centricity, they are talking about innovation, they're talking about aligning it perhaps with their strategy. So if they have a strategy, say, you know, this is what we're going to achieve over the next 5 years. In order to achieve that, we will need to have the following skills as a group, and this is what we're doing to further those. And we are seeing a handful of companies doing that. We're also seeing a handful of companies who set out those gauges of culture, but we're not really at a stage where it sort of comes across and it goes across all elements of the report, and it's not sort of substantial mass of companies who are at that stage.
It's what we would expect in the future, though, we hope. Yes. Another interesting question that's come in from Miranda Craig from the FRC is, are the companies that are linking culture with commercial benefits and business model more likely to be those that have adopted an integrated reporting approach?
Well, that's a good question. However, in the UK, there is this, I would say, cultural thing of not saying we produce an integrated report. So I think this year, off the top of my head, I would say about 7 companies say they produce an integrated report out of the FTSE 100. Now, that's not to say that there aren't many who do produce an integrated report, because there are. Somewhere between, I would say, 30 and 60% produce an integrated report. I mean, integrated reporting is a journey, right? You don't finish an integrated report. So some will be along that journey. So there's not a clear yes or no answer, but yes.
But in terms of, I guess, the wider value creation view, I suppose that would.
Absolutely.
Okay, great, thanks.
So the next one is around stakeholders, and stakeholders has been front and center this year for most annual reports. That's probably been the topic that companies have talked about more than anything else. I do think to some degree it is a little bit regulatory driven. Obviously, it's one of those areas where there's been a lot of regulation in terms of what companies need to be doing, a lot of guidance on what they should be saying and how they should be saying it, etc. And companies have been listening to that. So a couple of years ago, it was a different situation. Companies didn't know what to say and they didn't know how to say it. Companies are much more comfortable with what to say now, but it is still very, very regulatory driven. So we see 77 discuss value created for wider stakeholders in their business model. That's increased substantially over the last 5 years, but even 10% since last year. So this is the altruistic approach. This is how the kind of value we create for our shareholders. But then when you dive deeper in and look at something like chairman's statement, 64% talk about stakeholder engagement and how important that is in the leadership statement. Slightly less than the CEO. The CEO does that slightly less, suggesting again this whole focus on maybe it is because the regulatory requirements is focused very much on the role of the board in this regard. But we are seeing different approaches. We've sort of come up with a number of different terms for it. We call it a front loader, a back loader, a yin and a yang. So different companies take very different approaches to dealing with the new regulation. Some will front load everything in the strategic report and have very little in the governance report. And some will have it all sitting in the governance report and have sort of the most, section 172 statements in a very brief form in the strategic report. And then we have those who have the two different lenses, one section in strategic report, one section in the corporate governance report, that both very much talk to each other and perhaps even are visually aligned, and has a lens and strategic report on what is the operational elements of it. How do we engage with stakeholders? What are the key issues they're interested in? How do we use this information? How do we respond to them? And in the corporate governance code, it's much more focused on how is the board kept informed, if there's any direct engagement with stakeholders, what are the things the board will be looking at to ensure that stakeholders are considered and had regard for, and some case studies around what that looks like in specific decisions. And I think that is possibly one of those areas. So as you'll see, every other slide here is sort of where it's going less well, and this is one of those where it's going less well. It's 27% here have provides examples of how the board have considered stakeholders in major decisions. So 27% is I would say, relatively small percentage, given that, that's really the litmus test for this regard for stakeholders. Can you give me a specific decision where you have considered stakeholders and how you considered them? And I think when I look at how companies have done this, some of them have been very straightforward, has been a business as usual decision, something that impacted stakeholders, very, very good. But there's also been some who have used that as an opportunity to talk about the value they create for shareholders. And I think that's a pitfall. I don't think that is really the spirit of what we try to achieve here.
Moving forward, though, Anne, would you say that all companies are going to need to evidence how they're doing this, given the last few months that we've been living through?
Yeah. And I also think that there will be a lot more opportunity to actually evidence this. So I think we have probably up until now been in a stage where we think stakeholder engagement is really important. We sort of have a feeling that it is, and that's what we're talking about in annual reports. But now we've sort of got to a stage where actually it has become, obvious that stakeholders are the downfall. If that doesn't work, if you don't have a really strong relationship with your stakeholders, then that can be the downfall of you as an organization. So it's not just about the quality of the relationship with your stakeholders, but also about the success of your stakeholders. So if your stakeholders are successful, then you will be successful as well. So it's an ecosystem, right? It's sort of like the weakest link will be the downfall, and that might very well sit with stakeholders. And I mean, sort of going forward, I think we will have a lot more evidence to be talking about to evidence this feeling more than anything else.
I'd agree with that.
And we've actually, we've seen so much in terms of how companies have really listened over the last 3-4 months, listened to their stakeholders, whether that means in terms of sort of payment practices, whether that means supporting their customers, their B2B customers, if they are, say, in a dire state, or changing your product portfolio to accommodate your stakeholders, that what they can supply you with, you can then change your supply chains so that you can provide your end customer, also a stakeholder, with the products that they need. So it really, has crystallized what stakeholder engagement is and how important it is. Yeah.
Super. Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you.
So I think that's essentially also what we're seeing here. The initial stage here in stakeholder engagement is companies who would have, certainly I think most in the past, would have seen stakeholder engagement as something that was a sustainability issue. And now, the top stage here, the ultimate aim, how it is actually the success of your stakeholders is actually crucial for your own success. The next one here is around cognitive diversity. And I think this year we've been a little bit disappointed in what we've seen. I think it's a case of there are a handful of companies who are doing really well, and there are some that are sort of doing okay, and then there are some that are fairly behind. But we're not seeing a lot of innovation in this space at all. We have, reassuringly, 80% talk about diversity beyond gender, because the focus on the diversity debate has been very, very focused on gender, and I think that is not been the right approach. And I think going forward, we will see, certainly with the environment and situation we're in at the moment, I think we'll see a widening of that focus. But as you can see, 64% set diversity targets, which is up a little bit compared to last year, but that's probably some of the more positive improvements. Nomination committees provide commitment to a diverse pipeline. We've got more narrative around that, but that is also a requirement in the code. So I'm not surprised that that has gone up a little bit this year. Some of the things that is not doing so well is around target setting for the wider company. So not focusing so much on the board, but actually talking more wider company targets. But also this whole thing around explanation of how diversity supports strategy. So this is actually a corporate governance code requirement. And I think it's fair to say with 7%, that is something that either most companies have dodged or have found very difficult to do and have perhaps either not seen or deliberately not seen. 7% is a very low number. And I think overall, the whole debate needs to be focused more around opportunity, right? The opportunity, rather than moving the debate from it's the right thing to do to it's an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for winning the war for talent, an opportunity for sort of improving the quality of decision making, perhaps even sort of increasing customer insight if your workforce is more of a reflection of your customers, perhaps. Obviously improving your image and your license to operate are elements as well. Yeah. So that is really some of the things that I've been talking about here, the evolution of approaches. Diversity is a moral issue, but what we need to get to is that it's an opportunity for companies. So, responsible business. Responsible business is our fifth principle, and that really encompasses a lot of what I would say are how you behave as a company, partly doing the right thing, but also being a responsible employer, being a responsible part of the community, being a responsible company. And as we can see here, 87% express a commitment to wider value creation. So that is, something that's increased compared to last year. So companies want to do good. However, when we then go down and sort of drill down and look at what are the things that they are then putting out there, well, 31% commit to science-based targets. That's not a high number, but it's a relatively high number given how basically what we're seeing here is a story of two halves. So we have a number of companies who are very focused on this, who are very ambitious, who set ambitious targets and have ambitious targets plans, sort of strategies and plans. And then we have another group who are fairly far behind the curve. So for instance, I'm going to take you to some of these numbers here. Only 35% indicate that they have sustainability priority areas that were identified through a formal materiality assessment. And that suggests that the whole rest of them, they don't talk about how they've identified those issues that they think are most material, versus that percentage before talking about science-based targets. So you have two different groups that are miles apart, and that sort of obscures the data a little bit. And also, you saw from this slide, 60% talk about, how they're contributing to the SDGs. However, when you then dig down in that detail, you'll see that 12% talk about what specific indicators or targets, the specific SDG targets or indicators they're working towards. So each of the 17 SDGs have a set of indicators and a set of targets, but the vast majority of those who do talk about SDGs use the logo, talk about what they're doing, but keeps it very much in the same as usual, and is not necessarily focused on what is it actually we're trying to achieve specifically in terms of the SDG.
I was just going to add, one of the other things that we've seen is a lot of focus on climate, with the UK committing to 2050 net zero and TCFD around the corner. I think we've seen a huge increase in the number of companies beginning to report against the TCFD from about 39% to 67% this year. And I think one of the interesting things about, climate is, I think that there's a lot of talk about, imagine if we can take the momentum that we've taken to deal with this crisis, to transition the entire economy moving forward. I think that could be a very good one, because as Mark Carney said the other day, we can't self-isolate from climate change. It's coming. So we better do something about it now. And I think that builds back into your Build Back Better theme as well. So there's a lot of initiatives I know that corporates are going to have to focus on around these specific agenda.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that is very helpful, because that's sort of one of the issues that we're going to take you to now, which is transformational and long-term thinking. And I think it's fair to say, you know, when we start looking at how a company is telling this long-term story, companies over the last couple of years have been somewhat reluctant to tell a long-term story. I mean, we've been impacted by Brexit and the uncertainties around this, and then, you know, I suggest we will find it even more difficult going forward. So this whole thing of financial uncertainty has become the new normal, without a doubt, and that's impacting companies in terms of setting out that long-term story, in terms of target setting, in terms of long-term strategies, in terms of frameworks. But I think when companies don't know what the future entirely looks like, they focus on the things that they do know what will look like. And one of the things that is clearly the case this year is that the long-term story has become a sustainability story. So a lot of the indicators that we're seeing is around sustainability. So we have here 47% talk about, you know, have one or more strategic priorities that are focused on sustainability. We have 46 companies talking about climate change as a principal risk. That's compared to 14% last year. That's a massive increase. I am aware that there are some of the ESG raters and rankers who require companies to have climate change as a principal risk in order to get a little tick and a better score, so that there is a chance that that might have impacted this data. But it is a substantial change, and I think once it makes it onto the risk register and once it makes it onto the principal risk, that is when things are being monitored, and that's is when things start to change. And we're also seeing 46% talking about sustainability as a driver in the market review. So a driver of opportunity or a driver of change, which I think is also really reassuring. Also, when I then start looking at something like leadership statements, for instance, CEOs are really focused on it as well. So 59% of CEOs talk about sustainability, the majority of them around climate change, circular economy. And that tells me that if it is on the agenda of the CEO, it is something that is being actioned on. Now, while it is something that's being actioned on, there are perhaps some elements that still, you know, we're perhaps at that tipping point where we all know what it is that needs to happen. And certainly for that top group that I talked about before, they are in that process of you know, making that change happen, you know, to transitioning into a more sustainable economy, to transition into a low carbon economy, to transition into something that works for the future. But there are also, you know, this resistance to perhaps be talking about all the measures that you are taking at the moment before you have actually done it. And I think that's probably where we are at the moment, a little bit of a vacuum in terms of setting out what it is they are currently doing, but won't be saying for a little while. So, yeah.
And just a question or a comment from one of the attendees. And the point is, and we come across this a lot, the challenge, they've cited, this is Anne-Sophie Blouin, apologies if I pronounced that wrong. A challenge for companies is balancing the length of the annual report versus other reporting platforms. So she's saying, for example, some of the SDG targets and those sorts of things will be in the corporate responsibility report rather than the annual report or on the website. So what's your sort of advice to corporates in terms of navigating all these different needs and what goes where? Do you have anything that you can share that might be?
I think that's a good point. I would say that is obviously a very difficult line to thread. How do you do that? You know, what do you also want there to be enough balance to sort of, you know, you don't want to have too much focus on that because then that diminishes something else. but I definitely think there is an opportunity for companies to communicate that story a lot better across other platforms than the annual report, and focusing some of that content so that the story becomes more balanced. But if you are going down the road of reporting on how you do the SDGs, you know, setting out, you know, 12.2 or 17.5 doesn't take a lot of extra space, but it gives you a lot more credibility than setting out the SDG logo. So that was a sort of a micro practical perspective, but definitely I think there's also an opportunity for companies to align some of these things a lot better. You know, for instance, you know, when you talk about the SDGs, why are you not talking about that in relation to purpose? And why are you not talking about purpose in relation to your stakeholder engagement? Why are you not talking about all of these elements as a whole? How do they lock up? And I think that story lends itself very well to other mediums. You know, you can have a reflection of it in the annual report, but other mediums than the annual report would be able to tell that story much more effectively.
Yeah, so that connected, consistent story. But as we know from working with lots of clients, it's a challenge, yet an opportunity, isn't it, to get it right. Now, there's another actually interesting question from Wesley Boone. In line with some of the comments you made on the ESG rating agencies, how do you view the authenticity of long-term drivers, purpose of companies, with the increasing rules and regulations and social pressure? So how do we balance all of that? That's a question.
That is a great question. I think authenticity is, and I can see Sally laughing there. Our last year's report was called The Ecosystem of Authenticity. And the year before that, our report was called Less Perfection, More Authenticity. So authenticity is absolutely crucial, absolutely crucial. You can't be ticking all the different boxes. You can't be following all the different frameworks because that's the right thing to do, and doing it in a way that you've seen a million other people do it. It needs to come from a place that is authentic. And that might mean that you choose not to do certain things. And I think that is absolutely fine. And the whole thing about authenticity is it needs to be specific to you as a company. So when you talk about something, if it's boilerplate narrative you're using, then it's not specific to you, and then it's not part of that story that is your DNA. But I think there is an opportunity for companies to own that story a little bit more, rather than letting them be led by ESG. Rankers and raters are really important. Let's not forget that. And as more money, you know, is flowing into passive investments, that becomes even more important. But I think companies need to own their own story, and they need to decide what they will be doing and what they won't be doing. And then perhaps they can explain on their website why they've chosen to do what they do. I mean, a lot of companies might also say raters and rankers want them to communicate on issues that they don't think are material. Well, then communicate that on your website or somewhere where raters and rankers and your investors can see why you don't think that is relevant for you as a company. So own that story.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And we're hearing that a lot more and more from investors, aren't we?
Yeah.
The other thing I'm picking up from investors that I've been speaking to lately is there's this feeling that they're getting a bit savvier. They're looking for that authenticity as well. So that they're almost saying to us, you know, companies have to be a bit careful that they don't get caught out. They need to begin to evidence a lot better these things and provide real insights. So I think that's a really good question. Thank you.
I mean, investors are increasingly much more sophisticated, you know, issues like culture, for instance, and understanding the impact the culture can have on a company's long-term performance in terms of innovation, in terms of product development, and so on and so forth, is you know, there are picking up, you know, using machine learning and etc., you know, looking at all sorts of data from that goes way beyond the annual report, looking at the number of patents companies have filed, etc., etc. So the more you can tell that story yourself, the better.
Now, Anne, I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit about what you think the future brings. And at the same time, I'm going to launch the second poll for all of the panelists, which is actually sharing with us a little bit about what you think the future might be bringing for you. So I'll launch that poll and then hand over to you, Anne, to share what we think the future will bring.
Fantastic. Yeah. So as you probably be able to tell from what I've said so far, we think there's going to be an increased focus on purpose, you know, and connecting that purpose to all the other elements. So what is your focus meant in terms of your in terms of the COVID crisis, using that as an opportunity to explain and say more about what you won't be doing and what you will be doing, having a more focused conversation around purpose. Obviously, we will see a lot more around build back better solutions, I'm sure. And we will also be seeing a lot more around the changing relationship with stakeholders, you know, and how stakeholder engagement has gone from being important to being crucial for your own success. We'll see, I suspect, a renewed focus around sustainable economy, climate change, and circular economy. I mean, we've already talked several times in this meeting around all the different movements, all the different voices out there who are pushing for that. So there is no doubt about that this will come. And, you know, maybe 2 months ago, I would have said it's probably in the near term taking a little bit of a backseat in the very near term. But actually, I'm not even sure over the last 2 months what we're hearing. You know, we've had companies who said, oh, we had all this big, you know, targets we were going to go out with, but there's just too much going on. We're going to delay it a year. And have now then come out and said, actually, we only delayed it 3 months. Let's charge ahead. So I think we are at that tipping point where companies definitely will move on it. I think there's going to be a focus on a sort of, you know, that dual materiality lens, you know, which is, you know, focusing on materiality from a sustainability perspective, but also financial materiality, maybe a sort of more of a merging of those lenses, so that we don't have issues here that are just seen as important by some people in the organization and issues here that are seen by important by others. I think there's going to be more of a debate around impact and real impact. Not just value created, but actually the impact that you have, the potential to have vis-a-vis your industry, your particular nature as a company, and where you can have the most focus. So perhaps it'll be a case of we will have a set of hygiene factors that we will deal with that are responsible business, and then we will have some hero issues, which are the issues that we can really make a societal impact on. And then finally, just transition, you know, making sure that this transition is a fair transition for everybody, and a lot more focus around social inequality, I think, a lot more, which we already starting to see being communicated across different platforms other than the annual report at the moment. Yeah. So I think that's sort of where I see some of the big themes that I would expect companies to focus on more going forward. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm just sharing the poll, and I actually think most of the points, Anne, that you picked up on are being picked up on, and your views are very much shared by most of the attendees. Much more focus on non-financial issues, a lot more attention from investors on ESG issues in regular discussions. And some challenges with what those ESG issues are, which ones are material, but a lot of people working on all of those things. So I think we're going to see a lot of focus on ESG moving forward, which I think is really exciting, and the way forward. So that's great. Now, and just lucky last, well, I just see a few questions. Is there anything in terms of we've got a question from Chris Gurney, and he has a question about what do we think the impact or the level of disruption COVID will have on how companies will tell their story this coming year? I know with our analysis, there was only a few companies that addressed COVID at all. We know there's been lots of focus from the FRC with all the webinars we've been doing with them. But what's your view on how we'll see that impacted in reporting?
Well, so we've already done some, as part of this, when we did the research here, we looked into how companies were reporting on COVID. And obviously, as I said, a lot of them, even the ones that were delayed, were mostly talking about COVID as something that's happening in China. We don't know how it will impact us. And then we have seen some of those who delayed, but also the March year ends, talking a much more sort of integrated story. So we've seen companies go from thinking, oh, we just need to have one section that talks about COVID, or we just talk about it in this section or that section. And then they've sort of gone through the sort of evolution of saying, well, actually, it's relevant for everything in our report. It's relevant, it's been relevant. If you need to talk about what happened, you know, in the past 12 months, it actually impacted our business model, and it might actually impact how we think about our business model going forward. Definitely impacted our strategy. So we will also be talking about what that means going forward. And it certainly impacted our performance. And it certainly, you know what I mean? So it impacted all elements of the annual report. So what most, I think, companies will end up doing is having a section on COVID and then talking about it in the different sections where it makes sense, and having that one spread perhaps talking about you know, the sort of having an overarching story around it, then driving people out to the different sections so they can talk about it in relation to the particular issue where it matters. Does that make sense?
Yeah, total sense. Okay, just conscious of time. We've got a couple of minutes left. I've launched our final poll. Our final poll is all about looking forward and trying to understand what some of the challenges will be for you corporate, so we can help in any way that we can. And if we just flick through, I just want to give a little overview of what we've got going on. We've done the questions and answers throughout. As Anne said at the very beginning of her talk, that we've broken the report down into a couple of different sub-reports this year. The next major launch will focus on the building blocks, and that will be next Thursday, 2nd of July. Looking forward to sharing with you some of the detail about some of the traditional building blocks of reporting and how they're telling a more connected story. And then we've got 2 further webinars in, so we've got one webinar every week for the next 4 weeks. One will be with investors to try to understand what their changing expectations and demands are. I'm happy to say that we've got Sasha Sedan from Elgin and also Mir Zabag from Aviva joining us for a conversation about that. So I hope you come armed with lots of questions. And then on the 14th of July, we'll be doing a session with corporates and really talking to them about how they're coping and rewiring for resilience in the future. And they'll be sharing some case studies about that. So that, again, over the next 3 weeks, we've got a number of webinars. We'd love you to join up and join us. We just flip to the next one. The other thing is we're working hard on a number of research reports. We mentioned TCFD a little bit. This is clearly on the agenda moving forward. If you haven't seen, we launched our first report on TCFD just before Christmas last year. Our second report will be coming out in the next month, where we'll be tracking progress of the FTSE 100 against that. So look out for that. And also our Web 100, which looks at the corporate websites of the FTSE 100, will be out in September. I'm also launching a podcast series where we'll be talking to experts about the future of communications and reporting in this changing environment, to hear views on what they think corporates and boards need to be thinking about and communicating to their broader stakeholders. So that's what we'll be up to. And then one final thing that we'll be doing, which I would love to hear from a lot more of you, to really try to replicate the roundtable discussions that we always get a lot out of, and we know from our events that all of our corporates that come in and are kind enough to spend their time with us get a lot out of, is that peer discussion. So we'll be doing a number of sessions where we pick up, after we've finished our whole series of webinars, we'll be picking up on some of these discussions. We've got 4 scheduled dates. We're hoping maybe to get you together in job titles, but I don't think it really matters. And we'll be picking up on some of these key issues moving forward. So you can share with your peers some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities and how you're dealing with some of these issues. So I think that is all I wanted to say. A real canter through the research. We'll send around and be in touch with the presentation, and we'd love to hear from you and hear what you thought. And please, everybody, thank you very much for your time. I know there's a lot of these things going on, so I'm delighted that so many of you actually spent this last hour with us, and looking forward to continuing the conversation. Everybody, please stay safe and well, and I hope to meet you in person again soon. So take care, and thanks, Anne, for giving a great presentation and taking us through those findings. It was really, really fantastic. Okay, everybody, have a great day.